Why racism in the US is worse than in Europe. There are stories about police being called over Black Americans doing nothing more than being black in the US. In 2020, millions of people watched in shock and horror at the police brutality that led to the death of George Floyd in Minnesota and the violent demonstrations that spread across America. Thousands have also taken to the streets in European cities like Paris, London, and Berlin to vent their frustration with racism in Europe. Both the United States and Europe have had alarming cases of racial segregation and profiling, but many believe the situation in the United States is disturbing. In this video, our focus is on why racism in the US is worse than in Europe. As we proceed, we urge you to stay tuned and watch until the end. Racism in the United States. Throughout the history of the United States, racism has been reflected in discriminatory laws, practices, and actions against racial or ethnic groups. White Americans have enjoyed legally or socially sanctioned privileges and rights since the early colonial period. In contrast, members of various ethnic or minority groups have been discriminated against. Citizenship, criminal procedure, education, immigration, land acquisition, and voting rights have been enjoyed by white Americans. After the abolition of slavery, African Americans faced severe restrictions on their political, social, and economic freedoms. The Native Americans continue to face discrimination after suffering genocide, forced removals, and massacres. Hispanics, Middle Eastern and Asian Americans, as well as Pacific Islanders, have also been the victims of discrimination. In addition, non-Protestant immigrants from Europe, mainly Jews, Slavs, Italians, and the Irish, were often subjected to xenophobic exclusion and other forms of ethnicity-based discrimination. According to the United Nations and the U.S. Human Rights Network, discrimination in the United States is widespread and affects people of color. But it is not only in the United States that racism is rampant. Our following discussion will expound on that. Racism in Europe. On April 10, 2020, the death of Adil, a 19-year-old man of Moroccan descent, sparked violent protests in Brussels. The young Adil was killed by the police in Brussels while he was riding a scooter and trying to run away from a police check when a disguised police car crashed into him. During investigations, it was reported that the officer who killed Adil passed some racial remarks, which were also directed at colleagues under his supervision. Racism in Belgium has existed since the Independence Declaration of Belgium during the colonial era. A study conducted in 2011 indicates that racism against individuals from sub-Saharan Africa is significantly influenced by its colonial past. In 2002, a racism crime shocked Belgium when a man broke into his neighbor's home, a Moroccan family, killing 2 adults, injuring 2 children, and setting fire to their apartment. The killer was a notorious activist of the extreme right party. Today, racism is present across Europe, and at least 3 racial crimes are perpetrated in Denmark, France, Cyprus, Finland, and other European countries. Regardless of the number of racial crimes being reported across Europe, many still believe that racism is worse in the United States. How accurate is this assertion? Our subsequent discussion will conclude. The rising trends of racism in the United States. It has been established that racism towards Black Americans is unrelated to immigration or nationality. There is no country where African Americans can live. Domestic alienation, dehumanization, criminalization, and terror are the status quo. European racism is not good, but it was still more welcoming than American racism. Slavery and the various slave codes are state or federal laws that codify the inhuman practice of chattel slavery into law. The American South was more than just a place for enslaved people to live. The slave codes continued to oppress Black people after the abolition of slavery. Though Blacks have continued to endure racism during the Barack Obama presidency, many Americans felt progress was achievable despite the deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and countless other unarmed African Americans. The Black Lives Matter movement was created by raising awareness of these injustices on social media. Despite social media awareness, employing Black codes and masquerading oppression against Black people as democratic justice and fair law enforcement has sadly always been America's status quo. In a nutshell, racism is worse in the United States than in Europe because black lives have always been criminalized and treated with contempt. If the United States government continues to act indifferently, the rates of racial crimes will get worse. Thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell.